And hopefully everything should be working now. I'm going to make some assumptions about that being true. Okay.
You can maybe hide that message that's showing up. Google Glass is showing us anything.
Oh.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right, so now that okay, here we go. Welcome to New to PHP. I'm going to assume that most people here haven't done a whole lot of programming before. If you have, then most of the concepts that I'm going to be talking about are going to be pretty familiar to you. You might get bored. If you get bored, feel free to leave. There are thousands of other things to do and talk about while you're here. But we're going to introduce PHP and use PHP to introduce some programming concepts. This will be especially useful for you guys if, say, you've done some stuff with WordPress and you want to go further, or you've done some stuff with Drupal and you want to go further, but all the semicolons and pound signs and dollar signs kind of freak you out. Feel free to interrupt me to ask questions, because there is quite a bit of stuff that I'm planning on covering, but the most important thing is that when you leave here, you are a little more comfortable with actually touching code than you were before. Okay, any questions before I start? Okay. So, PHP is a server-side scripting language. There's a whole bunch of history that goes with it that I'm going to touch on a little bit, but I'm mostly going to treat this like plumbing, where there's a history of plumbing, but really what you want to do is fix your toilet. So we are going to treat PHP in that way. You want to be able to do some things. You're not too worried about the theory behind programming. You want stuff to show up in your web browser to get stuff done. So it was originally built for web programming. The guy, Rasmus Lerdorf, probably butchering his name, started it as a personal homepage scripting language. That's where it started from, and some of the problems that people have with it, if you talk to people out here and they talk about how bad PHP is, a lot of the problems that people have with it come from the fact that it started as a simple way to get stuff onto a web page. That being said, it is still one of the most common web page programming languages out there, and it runs things like Drupal and WordPress, so it is used all over the place, which means you're going to run into it if you work in the web pretty often. So why learn PHP rather than jumping into something like Ruby, or from Ruby on Rails, or Python, or Node.js, or one of the other interestingly named languages out there? Because it's common. It's probably the most common language on the web, and you can still do a lot of stuff with it. It does not have some of the modern object-oriented niceties that other things have. I mean, it's there, but they're not as fully formed, but you can still get stuff done with it. It's relatively easy to learn. It's not like learning C or Java or one of the other lower level languages that you have access to. It runs popular software, and it's almost always installed on servers. So generally, if you have a web page somewhere, like you got it on any of the popular advertised hosts like GoDaddy, it's going to be there. You're not going to run into the problem where you try to program something on Python and your host doesn't have it, so you can't get anything done, you know, or you have to bother your host for it, or you have to spend more money. Generally, if you have a web page, it's going to have PHP available to you. It runs anywhere. So if you're on a PC or a Mac or a Unix machine or just about anything else, you're going to be able to run PHP. You are going to need certain kinds of software to run it in a useful way. You need a web server. And again, PHP will run on just about any web server, but some examples are like Apache, Nginx, from Microsoft, the Internet Information Server, and there's a whole bunch of other more obscure ones, including personal web serving from older versions of Windows and web sharing from the Mac. And all a web server does is that is the thing that takes the request from the browser. So like when you go to Google, Google sends the request for a certain page to Google servers, and the web server is the software that accepts that request and does something with it. In the case of a PHP page, like say you're requesting a PHP page, it hands that request off to the PHP interpreter to look at a certain file and do something with it, and then return the results to your web browser. The web server software does all of that. And so to work with PHP, you will need a web server of some sort. Fortunately, there are a bunch of things that make that easier, especially if you're doing this for yourself. If you're on Windows, you want to look up a program called WAMP. That's W-A-M-P. On a Mac, you should look up something called MAMP. And that is Macintosh, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. That's the AMP. And that is basically the things that that piece of software comes with. So it's basically like all the stuff you need in this one little server package that you install it on your machine, and suddenly you can develop on your local machine. It makes your life easier. You don't have to worry about getting a host until you're ready. The other nice thing is PHP now comes with its own built-in server. So say if you have managed to get PHP installed on your machine, you can actually serve PHP directly from the command line. I'll be showing that in 1 second, which puts it up with a lot of the other modern languages. But it means that, for example, this Mac, when I got it, it had PHP installed on it, so I just had to use the internal server. And you'll have the web server, and then you'll also need the PHP interpreter, which is the thing that actually runs the scripts. So if you get WAMP or MAMP, you get that with it. You also have it if you can run PHP from the command line.
Hey, wait a minute, you just went over my head.
Okay, that's okay. That is fine. Where did I lose you?
Well, I got confused when you said PHP was already on the Mac that you had in front of you.
Because in most cases, it actually comes installed on.
Where do you find it?
I can show that to you.
Okay.
Okay, if it is installed, I'm going to be opening the command line.
Oh, okay.
And I will actually show you how that starts if it is on your machine.
Okay.
If it's not, using MAMP would work perfectly fine for you.
Gotcha. I think that's where I got stuck.
It's okay. It's okay. And anybody else, if you hit a bump and you're like, I need some help, just sing out and I will back up a little bit. So, when you are writing code, you have to write it in something, and it has to be in something that writes plain text, meaning it doesn't add things like smart quotes or special dashes or anything like that. So it can't be, Word or OpenOffice or anything like that. It has to be a text editor. Those are some of them on there. Notepad for Windows will work, or you can download something like Sublime or TextMate or Notepad++ on Windows. There are things like PHP Storm. Like really, if you look at Web Editor, you will get a couple of hundred different things. There is no bad one. There are just things that you prefer. Okay.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
What's the difference between one of those and MAMP or WAMP?
So this is when you're writing.
Yeah.
MAMP and WAMP is serving.
Okay.
So basically, you use this to write the code that the servers are going to interpret and give you an HTML page back.
So this is used to write the language.
This is used to write the language.
Is that kind of like those ones with the split screen where you write the language in HTML and then it shows you what it looks like over here? Essentially, it's that. But
It is kind of like that, except there's not, most of those don't have the thing that shows you what's happening.
Gotcha.
So, yeah, so basically, to use a metaphor, this would be like your notepad where you're writing stuff down, and the server would basically be Amazon where you buy the stuff that you've written. And if you decide that you really want to be techie, like you want to like get the propeller on your head and stuff, that Vim and Emacs are both really good at editors, but they are both very technical. All right. Excuse me for 1 second. I'm a developer, so this is more talking than I usually do in any 2 days. When you are writing these files to be interpreted, the way that the server knows how to interpret files is through the extension. And so the extension is basically anything after the last period. So if you were writing a file, it should be something.php. That's how the server knows what to do with it. Okay, just little things. And when you store it, it needs to be wherever that, and this is where it gets a little complicated. You need to store the file wherever the web server tells you to store it. So in the case of WAMP and MAMP, when you set that up, you can actually set the home directory, which is basically what the server is going to be staring at when you make a request. The server is going to look at that directory and look for that file in that directory. If you are using PHP, the PHP server, you can actually start that server in whatever directory, and that becomes your home directory, and we'll see that in a couple of minutes. Okay, so now we're actually going to start writing code. So does anybody have any questions before we go? All right. So how many people here have done any HTML coding? Like they've actually put something on the page and they've seen it in a web browser. Awesome. That's the first thing that we're going to do because PHP started that way, so you can actually write PHP directly into HTML pages that have, as long as they have the .php extension, and it will interpret that.
Can you change this on?
Yes, I can. I think.
I think it was under tools. No.
No, Windows, Zoom.
Ah, there we go. Thank you. That was the least helpful thing that could have happened.
Sometimes under.
Betcha. There we go. How's that?
Nice.
Okay. Excellent. Okay, so here we have. It's not scary. I promise. I promise it's not scary. So here we have the command line. This is when you're basically right on the server. And we are in a directory that has all of my files that I'm going to be working with. And what you can do is you say, hey, PHP. And it will tell you that you are in, we'll say PHP-S, which says, hey, I want to use the server. And then you have to tell it what address that you want to be able to put in the address bar of your browser. The easiest thing to do here is that, because that says you can either use localhost or the home IP address, and I'll tell you about both of those in a moment. And then that, which is the port number, which basically is, say your web server has a whole bunch of different telephone lines it listens to, basically. Those are the ports. Or sorry, your computer. When I say web server, I mean the box. The box has all of these different places that it listens to. And so you're basically saying, listen to this on telephone 9000. This keeps it out of the way of all of the other things it might be listening to. You don't have to really worry about this part, okay?
Is this starting the local server?
This is starting the local server. So right when I do this, it's going to give me some information, and it basically will, remember we were talking about the document root? It's telling me about that right here, and it's letting me know that what version of PHP I'm on, and that is the development server, and what time it started.
Now, how did it get that path? You put something somewhere.
Ah, okay. So I didn't put anything anywhere. This is actually where I am on my local machine. PWD tells you where you are in your local machine. So I am in this place on my local machine.
So you change directory to there first.
Exactly. I mean, you can start it anywhere. It's basically going to start it in whatever directory you're in, and then it just and all this is doing right here is reminding you where you are in case you've forgotten. Okay. When we want to quit, it's actually telling you how to quit right there, and that is the control button and C. That's pretty standard in Unix. You can use it everywhere. I don't need that anymore. And so now that we have a server running, we can start telling our browser to go to the server and do stuff. And I am on part 1, so if I go to 01, and I actually use the correct port number, 06, because I'm on slide 6. Sorry, guys. All right. So let's work through what exactly happened there. So there's obviously a file there because it's interpreting it and it's giving something back to me. So.
Good. Sorry.
No, that's did you get it?
No, I mean, I just opened it in the web browser and it's showing me stuff here like favicon.ico and something.
Yes,
on the terminal.
I can talk to you about that in a second. That's a little bit that has to do with your machine and not stuff in general. So we are, because I tried to be organized, we are actually on the file, and I don't know if you can see it there, index.php. Okay, so notice it has a .php extension, meaning it's PHP. But all of this is just regular HTML. You know, you can see that in any HTML page. It's interpreted just like anything else. All you're putting in there is hello world, and that is what you are seeing right there. Okay? Straight HTML, you know, first day of class stuff. But it is happening from your local server, and it's happening in a PHP file. Okay? We got to that PHP file by pointing our browser to 127.0.0.1, and this is the important part, that port number, and then wherever your files are located.
The 06 is line 6?
The 06 is just because I needed to organize stuff into directories. So if you see right here, I actually have a directory 06 because it's the 6th slide, so I don't get lost. Okay, and because we put 00000, when we were here and we did this command, see right there when I'm highlighting?
Mm-hmm.
So that means I can use this is my local DNS IP address, or I can use localhost. Okay? It just means I get to use either of them.
Okay.
It is a specific address that says this computer that I'm on. It's also called a loopback address if anybody ever says that to you. Okay, so simple. We have hello world. We're not doing anything new here. We are just kind of getting our feet wet in how the server works. So now, you're going to do, now we're going to actually write some PHP. So you're going to see the PHP tag that indicates there's actually PHP going on between these two places, and that's the open caret question mark PHP question mark close. That says to the server, hey, this right here, this is PHP, and we want you to send this to the PHP interpreter. And so what it does is it's actually going to run whatever is between those two tags. The other thing that we're going to be talking about is this thing called echo. And echo does exactly what it implies. It repeats back what is directly after that. That entire thing right there, between that one line, is called a statement. Okay, so that is a PHP statement. It is saying something to the PHP interpreter.
Echo hello world is a statement.
Yep.
Within the PHP tag.
Correct.
You can have multiple statements.
You can have multiple statements. Do you want to come up? I mean, because you're doing awesome.
Just clarifying.
Okay. A statement.
As opposed to the PHP thing being
Exactly.
part of the statement.
Yes.
Statements within.
Within the PHP, because eventually you will have huge, long chunks of PHP in their own file. The statement always ends with a semicolon. That lets the PHP interpreter know that this is where to stop. This is the end of the statement. You should go on to the next statement now. Your most common mistake that you're going to see is forgetting that end bit, and the interpreter, because it doesn't know when to stop, basically has an emotional conniption fit and falls over. And it gives you an error, and you have to go out and go back and go through your file and figure out where you forgot something. And so in practice, what that looks like is here. So really, all that talking that I just did basically produces this. And when you go and look at this in the browser, by changing that to lesson 7, you get exactly the same thing. Wasn't that exciting? Everybody's very excited, I can tell. Because all we did is replace the regular HTML with basically a statement that says, spit out this HTML. So we're not doing anything even really interesting yet. One other thing about statements to understand when you're doing PHP is spaces don't matter, they won't appear. Returns don't matter, they don't appear. So when things get spit back out from PHP to your browser, you could have a whole bunch of returns or a whole bunch of spaces, and they're going to be ignored. Okay? So it's important to understand that if you're trying to format a page or something, you actually have to get PHP to spit out the HTML break tags or image tags or spaces or anything like that. Because anything that you put in between those PHP begin and end tags doesn't show up.
So if you wanted to do hello world, I am here,
Mm-hmm.
you'd have to do like a, whatever the bracket is, PR bracket?
So, well, if you want it on separate lines,
Yeah.
absolutely. And this is why I have the code here. Because I would have to, if I do echo that, and then I say, go to the next line, and do that, because there's nothing in there that says go to the next line. Even though it's a separate statement, there's nothing saying go to the next line. Unless I do and actually put the tag in there. Better?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's okay.
So wait, is HTML and PHP similar, or why are you using some of the same tags of HTML?
Because what happens is PHP, it's like a two-step process. PHP chews things up and spits out HTML, and HTML is what your browser looks at.
Yep.
So if you're not spitting out HTML, your browser doesn't know what to do with it. So it has to basically be, kind of like cows have four stomachs. So the PHP digests it first, and then passes the HTML back to your browser.
Okay.
With the PHP in its own separate file that you would link to the HTML file, would you then still write that HTML-looking code, or would it be kind of its own thing entirely?
That is very situational, and it can, because everything, basically, it just sends stuff back to the server, and the server decides what to do with it. Usually it sends it back to the browser. But you can write something, and we will, that has no regular HTML statement in it. It's just going to be pushing out strings, and I'll explain strings in a second. You had a question as well.
Well, nobody laughed. But is that, so do all of the fancy languages with Ruby names basically chew stuff up and spit it out as HTML?
Basically, yeah.
Is there an analogy you could give me, like the four stomachs? Like it's like knowing Latin so you have a basis for all the other languages?
So it's not, it's that your browser only, it's because there's two different pieces of software at work. Your browser only knows how to interpret HTML. That's a massive simplification. But your browser only knows how to deal with HTML. So everything that the web server is going to give to it needs to be HTML. So all these application servers, PHP, Python, etc., all they're doing is taking their code and producing something that the web server can give to the web browser.
So they just translate it to HTML.
Exactly.
So is there a food analogy? Is it like bread, or is there like...
I could come up with one.
Because I'm just... Because then I'm wondering why. But you don't have to answer that. But it's like, basically, it all comes out as the same thing, but there's a bunch of different ways to make it.
Right, because different languages are better at different things, and different people have different preferences at different things. But whatever they produce ends up having to be interpreted by the browser. So it's kind of like, well, do you like Duncan Hines or do you like Betty Crocker? But you get a cake and it goes in your mouth no matter which one you use.
I was perfect. I was like, all of a sudden I could see it. Thank you.
So is there something that PHP excels in that some of the other languages don't, or that it cannot do that you would say Ruby does better?
That is a matter of opinion that I could start religious wars about, and I'm going to leave that to somebody else. It really comes down to preference and what you have to work with. Like, a lot of times people end up with PHP because they're already in WordPress or Drupal, both of which are created with PHP. So you kind of have to use PHP.
You're in America's Test Kitchen. They only have a contract with Coke.
Exactly.
Does it run faster if you not understand the HTML, CSS, and JS, and you code all in that? Is it going to run faster because it doesn't have to go through the PHP or Python? So learning those over PHP or Python and some of these others is going to help your web pages run better.
Well, yes, if you wrote everything in straight HTML, that would be great, except you wouldn't be able to store anything in a database. You wouldn't be able to accept forms or contacts or things like that. That's the power that I haven't gotten to yet. Like there's a whole depth like way down here that I'm getting you guys to about you know, basically, so why are we doing all this? It feels like a lot of Sturm and Drang for not doing anything other than throwing strings on the screen. So we're going to be getting there in just a couple of minutes.
I got a quick question.
Yes.
What's the echo mean?
Echo is just throw this out on screen.
Okay.
What an echo does.
It's like print, right?
Yeah, exactly like print,
Except.
except echo.
It's like when you're in a canyon and you just yell.
Exactly, and it comes back. All right, so so as we said, pretty boring so far, but now we're going to introduce variables, which is where you start getting the power from, because you're storing things in other things. So variables are just boxes to put stuff in so you can manipulate them. Okay, they all start with a $, and this is just because of the language. It's a $, then a letter underscore, and then any other letter number underscore. Don't worry, like if you do it wrong, PHP will tell you and yell. So, and the equal sign is the operator that basically says put this in this box. So let's demonstrate that. So here we start actually doing more stuff. You can see we still have regular HTML, and then we start with the PHP by saying, hey, we want PHP to start here. This piece is the variable. That's your box. You've named the box my message, and you've told PHP that it's a box with that little $. Okay, you're saying this is the box my message, and I want you to put this string into this box. Okay, so these words go in that box. We can also do numbers. You can put this number in that box, and this decimal can go in this box. Because programmers like to be complicated, it's called a float. Decimals are now called floats. I'm sorry. And echo can push those variables, the stuff that you have in those variables, to screen. So just like we did before, you have echo, and then instead of the quotes and then something in the quotes, you put the variable there, and it takes the stuff out of the box and throws it to screen.
And the reason there's spaces just because you're a human being and it's easier to read.
Yes.
Okay.
And text has to be in quotation marks.
Text has to be in.
Numbers do not.
Correct. So let me just give you a quick look at what that will look like. So it spits out my message, and then 2, and then that float 3.14. So, and this next statement, just put it in the back of your head and just let it sit there. It's not going to be important to you today. PHP is a loosely typed language, and what that means is that the various things that you put in that variable box will be manipulated based on how PHP thinks they should be interpreted. So if you put a number in something, and it should be a string because it's going onto the screen, PHP just says, oh, that should be a string, and it changes the type of what's going on. Today, you don't have to worry about that. You can forget that I just told you that. You can just let it sit in the back of your mind. Okay, but it will be important later once you start doing this for real. PHP is a loosely typed language. It changes the type of the thing in the box as it needs to. It's okay. It's okay. Believe me, we're gonna throw stuff on top of it. It's gonna go away in a second. Okay, so more about variables. So we've seen echo output them. You can also combine them. Okay, so this is when you start doing stuff with the variables. You have a person, and then you have a message, and then when you look at you can combine them with those little dots. Those, you see the little dots, it's message dot, and then a space, and then a dot, and then another variable. Those dots say put these strings together, one after the other. They're concatenators. They're like little plus signs for strings. And so if we look at that, so 9. Oops, misspell things. Okay, so you've put that message together and pushed it out onto screen. So, and all this is going to come together in a couple of seconds. Now we want to start, now we want to actually make things do something. Okay, so we're going to start by making a form. So if we go here, and you guys have filled out contact forms before, right? You know, you've done shopping on Amazon, you've signed up for email things, so you've seen this form. That's just straight HTML. You can see it right here. This action is the important bit because that is where you're sending this form. So there has to be a file there to catch, you know, or else you're just throwing, like, catch by yourself is boring and involves a lot of running around. So you're going to need a file on the other end to catch this and do something with it. The other important bit is that post, okay? And this is another technical thing. You just want to make sure it's there. That's saying that there's information that's going to be sent to the server. And as you can see right here, there's nothing in the process file yet because we haven't done anything with it, but it's going to be a file that just has this PHP stuff in it. So remember I said we're going to be getting away from the HTML? Right here, no HTML, just PHP. And what that becomes is we're going to add an if statement in there. What an if statement does is this is where you start to control things. Okay? If something happens, then do this. If something is equal to something else, then do this. All right, so we're going to take a little sidetrack into a couple of things. So if we have, so we set two variables. We put two things in the box. We put 0 and 10 in a box. And then we have this if statement that says, if variable 1 is less than variable 2, then do something here. All right, so on the front end, what that will look like. Okay, so it successfully did the if then and did the right thing. Then we can add an else here. Know if that failed. So if I change this to be 11, okay, this is your first error. So when you see something like this, you know that you have done something wrong. The important thing is going to be this line, because that says in your file on line 10, something has gone wrong. A little secret, it finds the error on line 10, but a lot of times, if it's a missing semicolon, it's the line before, because it doesn't know when to stop.
Right.
So we'll add that in. So now this is the other end. This is the if, then, else.
So every statement needs a semicolon after it?
Every statement needs a semicolon after it. And then when you have blocks of things, like in this case it's an if then, so you see how you have this curly brace here and this curly brace here? That's how it knows what to do with that if. Okay? So the if statement,
it wouldn't do any of
it would throw us an error again.
Okay.
So Exactly. It's all of this is stuff like commas and dashes and exclamation points in English. It is describing how the statements fit together.
You see this pattern in other languages.
Oh yeah, yeah. JavaScript has it. A bunch of different languages have different syntax. All right. So now, the other thing, I'm going to skip that because we are running out of time rapidly. Because I did this at home and every slide was about 2 minutes and I'm like, oh man, I'm gonna have so much time at the end. That's totally wrong. Which is not you guys, that's me. Questions are good. Questions are awesome. It means that you're paying attention. All right, so going back to this, we basically want to say if there's a post, so something has been sent from that form, we want to do something with that stuff in that form. So if there's a post, we want to take certain things out of that post, put them in a variable. Remember, we're putting them in a box with the equal statement, and then we're adding a different variable here. And the thing that we're doing with this is this post, that's something called an array, and that has a whole bunch of little boxes in it. I'm going to have to go back. I am going to have to do that. I was hoping to skip that. But, so, you have an array like this up here. Like, Tim likes chocolate, Jessica likes strawberry, and when it prints, it looks like that. So Tim goes to chocolate, Jessica goes to strawberry, Winnie goes to maple walnut. Okay? So that's the entirety of the array. You can print an array out this way with print_r so you can see what's in it. If anybody here is thinking about working with Drupal, print_r is going to be your most hated friend ever because you're going to find out things about variables that are passed around, but they tend to be, those arrays tend to be huge. So if I want to access part of that array, notice how there it is, you have the variable myArray here, and then you have Tim, and we're accessing Tim in that array. Okay, so you're basically, it's like there's a box and there's a name on that box. So if you have a whole series of boxes with names on that box, you know what box to open based on this little bit of syntax. Basically says find that box in this train of boxes. Okay, so in this case, we have a train of boxes called post, and we have the label person. That label person corresponds to in our form. Oh, you horrible thing. In our form, see this name here? This is where we're naming that box. So every time you have a name and a form input, that labels a box for you on the other end. And so when we actually put this all together finally, and somebody give me a name.
Joe.
And we submit it. So we have successfully made a form, submitted the form, had our catching PHP take the stuff that we had out of that form and do something with it. And most of the stuff that you do with PHP is that. You get a form, you do something with it, and the piece that we're missing is you put it in a database and do something from there, which is coming up. So, we just did a form. We have information, but we would probably like to save that information someplace permanently because we want to do something with it. All right. So there's a whole other piece of software called a database server, and what you basically will be using that for is for storing things in. You're going to say, hey, database server, put this in there, and the database server will be nice and store that for you until you ask for it back. The first thing that you have to do is you have to connect to the database server. And to do that, you're going to need 4 things. You need the address of the server. So the server lives someplace, so it has an address just like your house has an address. You have a username, basically the person that lives in that address that has certain permissions. You have the password, just like for Amazon. And then you have the name of the specific database right here. Okay, so that's going to allow you to access a certain database, a certain chunk of data on the database server. So once you have a connection, you're going to be able to do stuff with it. And in this case, we want to put stuff into that database. So you need a database query. Okay, and that's basically another line of code. It's a SQL statement that the PHP server sends to the MySQL server. So it's yet another level of what you're doing.
What's an SQL server?
An SQL server is the database server. SQL is the database language.
Oh, okay.
Screams quite a lot.
So let me shrink this down a little bit.
That's the M in WAMP. It's the IM.
Is the MySQL server? Yes, that's exactly correct. So we want to insert into contacts these fields, the values, and then just like we did with the name, the person before, we're taking the values from that post. Okay, so you're accessing those values in the post. Okay, because we're doing a contacts database, I updated that form to have a first name, last name, and phone number. And then we're going to be putting them into the database. And so what that looks like when you put that all together we have a first name, last name, and phone number. And you submit it. And you don't see anything on this page because I haven't echoed anything on that page. Remember, there's no HTML over there, so there's nothing for the browser to interpret. But conveniently, I have this little thing that looks at my local MySQL server. And as you can see right here, you can barely see right there because it doesn't let me zoom in at all. Is I have that's the data that I just put in. So that is now safely in the database server, and I can get it out later.
Does it store a local copy within the PHP folder?
No.
What does it do?
It is an entirely separate thing. There's nothing local about it. If for some reason your database server went away, that also, all this information would go away. So when you hear about like security break-ins or something going wrong, it's because somewhere a database server, something has gone horribly wrong. Okay, they are much bigger database servers than what we're working with right now, but it's still all kind of the same thing. Your biggest difference is scale. Now, if people have to go because it's, technically we're done, that's fine. If people want to stay for me to finish this off and ask questions, feel free. I'm also going to stay around during lunch, so if people have more questions, you can ask me. So we have a form. We're storing stuff in the database. I'm going to pause for a second now that I've said that and said that I'm going to stay. Do people have questions for me? Stuff that they don't have it totally clear? Okay.
Did you have to create the table first?
You have to create the table first. So when you're doing this, because it has to know how to store the data, you guys will have to create the table. So you have to go into the database and make a field for first name and a field for last name and a field for the phone number. Okay. Since most of you are coming from, WordPress or Drupal, most of that stuff will hopefully already be there, and you're just manipulating it. So next, we want to actually get stuff from the database, and this is where we start throwing a whole bunch of HTML back at the screen. And so here we are. Here we're connecting to the database just like we did before. And we're creating the query for inserting stuff into the contacts. Okay, so all this is stuff that we've done. We're actually running the query, which actually sends the stuff. Remember, here we're just building this big string to make the statement, and then we're actually making that statement go. And now we're going to talk to the database server again and say, all right, that stuff that we just had you store, we want that stuff back. We want to do something with that stuff.
What's the arrow?
This guy?
Yeah.
Okay. So, arrows like this, little single dash arrows and the little greater than sign, in PHP say that this is part of an object. Okay, so this gets into object-oriented programming. An object you can think of as a machine that has different things that you can tell it to do. So in this case, we have actually made a MySQL connection machine and called it link. We've stored it in the link box. So we have this database connection machine. And we're saying, okay, connection machine, we are telling you to do the query part of your job. Okay? So it's just a function of that object. It's a function of that machine. Good catch, by the way. It's funny, when you've been doing something for as long as I have, there are so many little details that you just kind of gloss over as really important. So now we want to get stuff back. So we want to ask the machine for the things that we have put in the database. So that is this query here. We are selecting everything, all the fields, from contacts, which is that table that we made. And then we want to ask the machine, we want to tell the machine we want to do this query. So see, we're using this variable. Again, we're bringing that box back into it. So we're telling it to use this box with this query. And then that's going to give us all of the stuff out of the database. And we're going to put all of the stuff out of the database into this box so that we're storing it somewhere so we can use it. Okay, so we have all this stuff in a box. Now we want to root through that box, and we want to display everything that is in that box so that we know all of our other contacts. So what we do here is we end the PHP portion. It's like, PHP, we are done with you for now. We can stop sending stuff to the interpreter. And we want to throw some HTML on there. And because they're contacts, they work as a table really well. So we start the table here. Okay, so that's straight HTML. It's going to be put straight on the screen. And then because we're liars, we start up the PHP interpreter again, because now we have to start accessing that variable. And this is another control structure, just like the if is a control structure. There are control structures everywhere for doing a whole bunch of different things. And what this is basically saying is, take this result, remember that variable box, and we're going to be fetching things out of it. That's a command. and putting that into another box called row, which is just that row from the database. Database table has a whole bunch of different records in it. We just want one for now. And what this while is saying is, as long as we can do this, keep throwing stuff on the screen. And this is our old friend echo. Okay? Again, we're going to be putting stuff on the screen, so we're using echo. And we're using echo to build the HTML. So we're building the rest of the table, but with the variables from the database in it. All right? So table row, end the table row, and then in between, those rows are arrays, just like that post was an array, and we access it in the same way. So we want to get the first name field, we want to get the last name field, and we want to get the phone number field. And so when we do that, put it all together, and we say then you get this entire list of everything that was in the database, including the last thing that we did. How are we doing, guys? There's kind of a lot more here than I kind of felt there was. Yeah. But this is just a kind of getting your feet wet, explaining what all of those little squiggly things are for PHP. And for a long time, like, this is all that you did with PHP and a lot of the other languages. It's like, I'm making a contact form, throw stuff at a database, get stuff out of a database. And for the most part, even when you're doing complicated things, like if you're talking about Facebook, that form where you're talking about your status, that's what this is. It has some complicated JavaScript on there, so you're not submitting, but it's basically throwing it at a database and getting it out of a database. Does anybody have any questions? Yes?
So is most of the time PHP in the same document as the HTML? But sometimes, you know, you're going to get a lot of PHP, a lot of stuff, and you want to, like, store it externally. But how do you don't reference it the same way you do with CSS?
No.
How do you do it?
So remember that the PHP happens first. So in the order that things happen, the web browser says, hey, I want this PHP page. The web browser sends that request to PHP first. Okay? So you have these huge PHP files, right? And they can basically, they can do some templating, which means reading an external HTML file and putting stuff in there. Manipulating, because an HTML file is basically a string. So it can search for things in there and replace things. Okay? And then as long as the result of that PHP file, as long as the echo that it uses is HTML, the browser's just fine with that. So you have a giant PHP file that does all of this stuff, and then every once in a while it echoes what it's done so far. And that's how it is. You don't have really giant HTML files. You have giant PHP files that push out the HTML.
So the HTML could be located somewhere else?
Mm-hmm.
So you can have, like, these files, PHP, and they can work together.
Yes.
It's just kind of complicated. So only to me, because I'm an idiot, one. But secondly, you know, I'm used to working with CSS outside of HTML. And I can have, like, a bunch of CSS files.
Yep.
Reference one HTML file.
Yes.
When I start working with PHP, I get kind of.
You can so with PHP files, you can also do includes, which is basically you have a master PHP file, and then it includes other PHP files. Okay? That's how you organize them and split them up, just like you would with the CSS files. Yes.
So with the includes, if you came up with a process, you honed it, it was just right, and you're going to repeat it all the time, that becomes a separate process file that you then include.
You are exactly right. Once you start doing that, those are things called libraries. So you have this library of functions, which we didn't get to, that do stuff for you. Okay, functions are another way of splitting stuff up so that it is more organized.
I was just going to observe that in a WordPress site or a
Mhm.
Joomla site, imagine a Drupal site as well, that you actually don't have HTML files sitting there. It's all PHP, and the HTML is built on the fly.
Correct.
So in terms of styling it, what you need to style is the HTML that the PHP produces.
Yeah. They're not, a lot of times they're not HTML files, even though that's where the HTML lives. They're template files. But they're HTML
They're reaching
files.
into a database saying, get me the title, get me
Exactly.
the content, get me the author.
It helps
the
to
date.
say it reads PHP first.
Yes.
So that's kind of like, that's the logic.
Exactly. PHP first pushes out HTML, which the web server sends to the browser, and the browser interprets.
So in WordPress, just following on that example, if you wanted to tweak something, you would go to index.php, figure out where logically that PHP file was referenced, go to that. If you can make the right edit, edit it, and then...
Yes, it's a very long chain of this is including this, which is called this from this included file, which is why if you look at that documentation, they talk about where different files are located and where you make the changes, because it is so sprawling so that they can keep things separate. So that if you're only working with template files, you just have to go and find the template files. And there was a question back there.
Yeah, it's kind of technical, but whenever I'm like reading over like security flaws and websites, it always has to do with PHP, and so I'm not really sure what part of PHP is where the security is coming from.
A lot of places. So this is the so PHP is the most common mode of attack because it is the most common thing out there. You have WordPress and Drupal and Joomla and a lot of other things that are built on PHP. So if you want to find a security flaw and you want to get in somewhere, you do it in PHP. And the way it was built made certain assumptions about the environment because it was built to be run in HTML files. So it still has like all of that legacy that hasn't necessarily been cleaned up, whereas other things were built with a different use in mind. But a lot of it, even though it's they talk about PHP, the flaw is actually in the programming. You know, so if there's a flaw in Drupal, it may be the Drupal core code, but there's also all these modules that you add on to, or WordPress add-ons, and so you are dependent on everybody who has ever coded a module or an add-on or anything in the core to have followed security best practices, because if they didn't, there may be an attack vector somewhere in there. So that's where you're getting some of that stuff. Plus, because there's different versions of PHP, if you're running PHP 5.5 and they've come out with 5.6 that closes a security issue in 5.5, but you're not running 5.6, you're still vulnerable. Or your web server, you know, your web host is not running the newest version yet. But the caveat to that is if they force everybody to update and all of the people that they're hosting, their stuff suddenly doesn't run because it's a new version of the software, then you have a whole bunch of angry people who don't want to pay you. You know, so it's that balancing act where, you know, you're dependent on a host who needs a whole bunch of other people, and so this is why web security is hard, is because there is, you know, even just the 4 things that we're here talking about today. There's the browser that has to be secure, and the web server that has to be secure, and then the application server that has to be secure, and then the database server that has to be secure, and then all the code that's written to run on those has to be secure. So, well, it's, you know, it's one of those things. Things are built on top of things to continually make things easier. Because when I first started this, If you wanted something on the web, you had to write like basically your own little tiny server and little tiny application in C. So nobody was doing it because it was huge and complicated.
And so they used other ones, and if they had a vulnerability, it came into yours.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Yes.
Well, speaking of versions, and a few years ago, I tried to just do this for fun, and I was trying to find a WAMP server, or the WAMP we were talking about, and there were so many different. There was WAMP this, WAMP that, so many different versions. I couldn't get it to work. Can you recommend? Is there a specific one or a specific place?
I have not worked with WAMP because that's for Windows.
Okay. Or you're on WAMP.
So I'm on. So actually, I am using the local PHP server because that's really easy. And just to kind of close everything out, so I can close the Hangout. Thank you guys. I am sorry I did not get quite as far as I wanted to, but next time I will keep that in mind, and maybe we'll do a 2-hour intro.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. And I should have the slides and the code up somewhere, and hopefully there will be some sort of contact where you can say this was good, or even, which is even better, tell me what I can improve. So.
Where do you have a company, or what is it?
I work for WGBH in Boston.
Oh, okay.
So I work for a large corporation.
Building their websites or servers? Or?
We actually do. My part does a lot of